Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello friends, I hope that you've been well. In today's video, we are going to be painting my girl gang character, Momo. I went into this illustration in the hopes of only using watercolors, and while I'd say that the majority of this piece is watercolors, I did end up quote unquote cheating and using some gouache and acrylic gouache in the kind of very late stages of this piece. But basically, as you might already know if you have been watching a lot of my videos, I did the original planning sketch on my iPad using Procreate, including the kind of color comp as well. And then I print it out onto copy paper, trace it onto watercolor paper, and then go from there. So here you can see I'm selecting the colors that I think I'm going to need based off of the color study that I did on my iPad there. And I never wash my watercolor palettes, so I'm going to be just reusing the dried up paints that's on the palette there as well. So how I began this illustration, I first get all of the color mixtures that I need ready to go. So I have a little squeeze bottle of just regular tap water that makes it just easier to dilute and add water, clean water into the palette there. And then taking a clean, wet paintbrush, I start just painting water onto the buildings there because I want the paper to be damp while I add in these washes of yellow and pinks. And this allows the colors to really like bleed and blend in together like really seamlessly. And I add this layer in first because basically it's going to be the reflection on the glass of these windows. And I want it just to be a very soft kind of blend of colors. And then later on, I'm going to add in the structure of the buildings on top of it. And in this stage, I continue to map out the lighter warm tones that I need in this piece. I find that I like to work with the warm colors first. I don't know why, but that's just the way that I like to structure it. And then going in for the flame here, similar to the buildings, but this time it's a lot more specific in where I want the colors to be placed. So I made the entire area wet with just a clean paintbrush again. And now we're going in with the yellow, leaving just that center of kind of the root of the flame completely bare. And then going in with a vermilion, I think it is, like a very orangey red on the edges of the flame there, and working as quickly as possible so that everything is still damp so that they blend in together. And then for the very tips there, I'm using a magenta. And I find that with this piece, it's going to be leaning very purple and blue. And so I wanted to include a magenta in the reds just so it felt like it sort of blended better with a purple. Like I find like purple and pink are a really good bridge of colors together. And then I give a similar treatment to her skin here with making the paper wet and then adding in the yellow and then the pink. And I'm concentrating the yellow, of course, where it would be closest to the flame. I also include the yellow on where like the highlights of her hair would be. The thing about this piece is that primarily it's all gradients, and that's kind of because lately I just haven't been that interested in doing intense rendering like in a quote unquote realistic sense, but I obviously still want to create some kind of dynamics in my painting. So I decided to go with like a gradient approach. Another technique here that I did with trying to get these like really seamless blends of gradients is you can see I'm actually holding two paintbrushes at the same time. One to actually paint the color down, and then the other one, which is just damp, I use to help sort of buff the edges to get that smoother gradient. And again, the key is to work quickly so that the edges are not drying in between like your transition colors, because then it looks really harsh and it'll be patchy. So that's why I'm kind of going in with both brushes at the same time. And the thing about doing this is it's never going to be perfect. I definitely, kind of went outside of certain edges and things like that. But yeah, you can see at this point, I'm actually even holding two of the paintbrushes and then painting with the really big one, because I knew that this kind of bottom area was a lot to cover. So it didn't really make sense to be doing that with the round pointed brush. But before we continue, I just want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. As you might know, Squarespace is a great platform that is so versatile for many different applications as a creative. One of those things is having an online store. Here I have a secret shop that allows all of my patrons to access the previous Patreon print and sticker rewards, so you can get all of the Zodiac ones that you missed out on. And a great feature is that you can actually connect your Square Reader to your shop so that you can keep track of your inventory if you do in-person events as well, which makes everything so streamlined. So if you're interested in checking out Squarespace, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So some of you might know, over on my Patreon page every month I create a new postcard artwork and sticker design that I mail out, and for this year I picked the theme magic. Last month I had painted a witch, and then the couple months prior to that I had painted magical girls, and so this month I decided I wanted to do a magical girl but with a more badass twist, because the previous magical girls that I did were definitely much more soft, cutesy, demure. And I recently finished watching the Netflix animated show Gentry Chow versus the Underworld, and I absolutely loved it. Very underrated. I have not heard anyone really talking about it, but it was just sort of recommended to me on Netflix, and I was planning to cancel my next Netflix account that month, and so I was like, okay, let me binge watch this show before I cancel. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought the animation and the style and the colors and the story were so good. And not to, give away too much, but basically the main character, she has fire powers. And I just really love the look of fire. As many of you probably know, I'm also a massive Avatar: The Last Airbender fan. So I just think elemental powers are very cool. So I created this girl gang character on accident, I suppose. So when I originally painted this character, it was just meant to be like a one-off illustration. The illustration was just meant to be a sukeban, which is a high school girl gang boss. And then I just kept drawing her because I liked her design and my audience seemed, really interested in her as well. And then we gave her a name, and then she's kind of been like my unofficial mascot, so to speak. She's like been my icon for quite a while now. And the thing is, I am not somebody who has any real intentions of making a webtoon or manga or like any story of any kind. So when I create like an original character design, it's more just like a loose vessel for me to create illustrations from. I'm not really like building a backstory necessarily, but I do love the idea of sort of adding some kind of, loose lore to this character. So I decided, why not give her some kind of, like supernatural power. And so I thought that since my vague understanding of this character thus far has been that she's an Aries and she's definitely feisty, she's got a little bit of a, spunky personality. So I thought that giving her a fire power would be really suitable. And the first time that I drew her holding a baseball bat. So I thought, why not have her be a character where her firepower is only used through a weapon? Like, she needs some kind of vessel for her firepower. And so I combined the fire kind of emanating from her like spiked baseball bat. And that's kind of where this was born. And it's probably no surprise that her character design is also very much influenced by my love of Sailor Moon as well. And as I had mentioned earlier, I have been sort of trying to recapture some of the essence that I had in some of my older illustrations. I have been pretty dissatisfied with a lot of my work in the past couple of years, and so I'm really trying to grow and evolve and understand where it is that I want my artwork to go. And so one of those kind of exercises, I suppose, is by plucking artwork of my own that I like and deducing what it is I like about those pieces and trying to kind of use that as a launching point. And so something that I used to do a lot more of that I haven't a lot lately is more kind of detailed environments and backgrounds, like having a character like actually in a setting. And so I wanted to, use the Sailor Moon 90s anime as inspiration on the backgrounds and how I approach them, because I don't want my backgrounds to be hyper realistic. I like the idea of them being really colorful and stylized. And I think that the 90s Sailor Moon backgrounds are just chef's kiss. I think they are amazing. So I definitely was very, very heavily influenced by those and incorporated it into this illustration. And to go back to talking about the process here, you can see that I do a lot of layers when it comes to my watercolor approach, and I end up adjusting the colors constantly. And the main color that was giving me a really hard time was the sky. The digital version that I have, it was this very specific sort of periwinkle color. It's like lands right in between a purple and a blue. And then the gradient that I had was that it leaned a more kind of sky blue, like a typical sky blue, closer to kind of the bottom of where you see the skyline there. But I kind of made the mistake of just not quite nailing the color right away. And so I keep layering different shades of kind of pastel purples and blues over and over, but then it ends up getting darker and darker as I layer them, since it's watercolors. And so I need to get into the habit of either doing a color study with watercolors before I start painting, or I just need to be less attached to the digital version, because the thing about doing a color comp digitally is that I'm never going to be able to recreate the colors exactly that's digital into traditional, especially something like watercolors. So anyway, I was really struggling with this piece kind of in the later half. But something that I do feel like I didn't have trouble with and I feel really satisfied with is actually the flame. I am so pleased with how it turned out, because I had a vision for it and it turned out the way that I'd hoped. And this is something that I really want to be able to lean more into with my watercolor illustrations, as opposed to having to always rely on other mixed medias. And when it came to the flame specifically, as I mentioned before, a key element is having all of your colors that you want to use ready to go, and laying them next to each other or over each other while everything is still wet. And then you can see I actually have like a blob of water that I put just like on the side of the masking tape there, because I wanted to be able to have a untainted reservoir of water to be able to buff out the edges. That way I'm not muddying the colors with the dirty water that I had on the side. I know a lot of people actually recommend having 2 jars of water, one that you clean your paintbrushes from, and then one that you use to use in your actual painting for this purpose. But I don't have a second jar of clean water for whatever reason, so I was just doing that. And yeah, I was keeping that kind of like center of the baseball bat basically like untouched so that you would get the kind of full effect of the contrast. But as I mentioned before, I did end up introducing some gouache into the painting because, as I was saying, the sky was just not the color that I wanted it to be. And I had not touched my regular gouache in quite a while, so I had to add water to the inside of this tube of white because it had nearly dried out. But thankfully, when it comes to regular gouache, at least it is water activatable, so I'm not having to completely throw this thing away. And so I added like a touch of ultramarine blue and some white into some leftover watercolor here, and aiming for that perfect in between periwinkle color. And I do test it out on a swatch of paper here, but the thing is, I should have known, the mixture that I made, even though I did add gouache to it, and gouache is an opaque medium, it was not opaque enough. It was still very much diluted with a ton of water, so it wasn't as light as I had wanted it to be. But I did knock out kind of the brightness of that turquoise, which was something that I wanted to do because I just felt like it felt a little bit too out of place with the general color palette that I had going on here. It was just leaning a little bit too kind of aqua and was feeling like it was overpowering the rest. And then something that I realized that could have really benefited this piece was I felt like this kind of corner of the illustration was a little bit too bare, and to reinforce the impact of that flame, I thought, I should totally add in a cast shadow. And so that's what I decided to throw in there, and I feel like that is not the exact shape. I don't think that shape is probably right, but it's not that important. I think where I want to go with my illustrations is I want to worry less about being quote unquote realistic and just, do things in a way that serves the illustration just like visually. Obviously, I'm still taking inspiration from real life to a degree, but I want to worry about it less because I feel like something that holds me back with some of my illustrations, especially in approaching something that's more involved with like a background and a setting and things like that, I'm always concerned about, is this realistic? Is this the quote unquote right way to do it? And I get kind of worked up about the quote unquote accuracy of something, and then I just don't do it at all. So I'd rather just go for it, even if it's, a little bit stylized or, interpreted in a way that's not true to real life. And now we are moving on to the buildings. So this is where I start mapping in all of the windows, essentially, like the window frames of the buildings. And for the tops of the buildings, I use a darker purple. And then as I make my way towards the kind of mid section and the bottom of the buildings, I switch over to like a lighter purple to kind of get that fade out into the middle ground, I guess, to just have it sort of atmospheric, I suppose. And yeah, this is something that I am adopting from my inspo of the Sailor Moon backgrounds, of course, and also leaving room for the classic shoujo sparkles as well. I don't know if sparkles is quite the right term for it. I guess it's more of like a bokeh effect, I think. The effect that you get with a camera when you lower the focus. I'm not very good with cameras, so I might be totally wrong. But in any case, Now to move on to actually painting more of our character here, it's pretty rare for me to focus more on the background than it is for the main character of the illustration. But again, when I was looking at some of the illustrations of my past self that I really enjoyed, some of them were way more background focused, which is quite interesting because backgrounds is something that I just have always found quite intimidating and have typically been much more character focused. So it was an interesting situation to be less focused on the character here. But don't get me wrong, she technically is the focal point of this illustration, but just the way that I ended up approaching this process, she kind of came as an afterthought to a degree. But the thing about having a illustration that's more background and less character, or like the character is a lot smaller, is it makes getting the face a lot more challenging because the face is scaled down so much. It's so tiny. So I do have to be very careful about every little stroke that I make, and also not worry too much about all the ins and outs of rendering. It's more about just getting the very basic, highlight, shading, and key kind of things there. Like this character, typically I have like way more details on her in terms of like hair accessories and stickers on her face and things like that. But I knew that this was going to be scaled down so much. So I really needed to kind of bring it back and just focus on the key elements, which, I did one bandage, one sticker, a couple of hair berets, and some earrings, which is, I think, enough to sort of serve the character design. In hindsight, I could just paint bigger. I almost always paint 8.5 by 11, or in this case, the actual paper is 9 by 12. But then when, I take into account of the masking tape, it ends up being, roughly letter size. And in my mind, I always think that painting smaller means it'll be faster. But in this case, painting larger might have been better in the case of having more room to get her face right. But in any case, it's, we've already done the illustration. So, but yeah, then we started introducing some acrylic gouache because I just wasn't satisfied with the background or at least the color of the sky, I should say. And so I busted out the acrylic gouache and brought in, this very like light blue and pale purple, still diluted with a bit of water, but they will have better coverage and get the color that I wanted for the background. Unfortunately, the background, after having done so many different layers on it, it didn't end up being as smooth or like, pristine of a gradient as it originally was, but I think I was willing to let that go if I got the color right. And at this point, since I'd already busted out the whole palette, I went ahead and added more little touches of acrylic gouache to areas that I thought needed a little boost in color. I really wanted her to stand out, so I added a more magenta color, like neon magenta, to a lot of areas. Since even though with watercolors, after a number of layers, you can get like a certain level of vibrancy, I find that acrylic gouache, it really just can't be beat, especially this like fluorescent pink that I have. It's something that I am sort of a slave to at this point. I find that I just end up using it in everything because it just looks so magical. But the problem with it is that you can't really fully capture it when you scan and print it. So that is something that is unfortunate, but it still reads really, really nicely. I think on camera as well as in person, it's amazing. But so I did end up adding that neon pink onto the kind of tips of the flame there as well. And admittedly, I didn't film as much of kind of the later half of this illustration just because I was starting to get fatigued with it. But I think the last important section here that I did film is getting the classic shoujo sparkle effect, and I did map out where I wanted them to be with colored pencils first. I'm alternating between like a pink and a yellow tone, and basically using a round brush I create the outer edge of the color slash circle, and then with nothing on this filbert brush I just sort of buff in the edges and then move them towards the center, and then you kind of get this very transparent look to it, and also just helps fill up this sort of mid-section part of the background without having to really think about what would be placed here in a realistic sense. And yeah, that pretty much wraps up the illustration. I'm not like 100% on this one, but I am proud of myself for finally going ahead and doing a environment since it's been so long. But I am really, really pleased with this month's sticker, which also features, you know, a flame wielding girly. So if you're interested, if you sign up anytime between now and June 30th, you can receive this illustration as a postcard and then that holographic sticker in the mail, as well as lots of extra goodies that I have on Patreon, including a podcast. I do exclusive videos every month. There's over 50 of them that you would have access to, and wallpapers and things like that. But of course, no pressure to support me monetarily. I will happily accept any engagement on this video, and I appreciate you for being here. So thank you so much. And I hope that you're all staying safe and having a good day or evening wherever you're at. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.